Professor Stephen Caliendo from North Central College on the line. And Professor, you and I have spoken several times during the last month and a half or so about this trial, about where it was heading. Your initial reaction to the conviction on all 34 counts?
Well, I agree with you, guys. I mean, I wasn't too completely surprised of the decision. But it was quicker than I expected. I thought maybe they'd at least wait until tomorrow so that they have the weekend, but it came back pretty quickly. And the questions that they were asking the judge yesterday afternoon and the clarifications they got this morning did point in this direction.
You know, the GOP's response, swift, and I'm talking about on Capitol Hill. They're already calling this a political exercise. I just, through your lens, you know, this is uncharted territory, and I'm just wondering, you know, when you go into the classroom in the fall, you know, how do you set the stage here, the landscape here? You know, what did we see happen this afternoon?
Yeah, well, we'll continue, Scott, to talk meaningfully about what this means in a historic sense. There is at least, you know, close to 40% of people who this won't matter at all in terms of their support for the former president. They'll either explain it away because it was a biased process, or they will say, you know, this is all part of the game. Everybody does this. Everybody does these kinds of things, and it's not fair that he's being held to a different standard than other people. Other students are going to be very happy that they would feel like justice was served in this case, because he shouldn't have gotten away with this kind of activity. And we're going to have meaningful conversations about what it means to live in a democratic society.
So, yes, what do you think going forward as far as the campaign goes? How quickly will that campaign commercial come out for him? How quickly will he send those fundraising emails?
There's no question he's going to continue to fundraise. He's been fundraising off of the indictments for the last 2 years. And so he will be fundraising off of this, and that's appropriate. It's understandable. I think that with the sentencing coming just days before the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee, that really adds a new wrinkle of interest to what's going to be happening just up the road from us in July.
You know, the president, the former president, has been delivering a very common refrain, especially in the last month or so, and I'll use the word victimization for lack of a better word, that this is, you know, election interference, that Biden is the orchestrator of his plight. Do you think, now that we've seen, again, conviction on all 34 counts, that will resonate not necessarily with the hardline Trump supporters, but with those on the fence?
I think that's a fantastic question. I think if you were predisposed to believe that the fix was in, you're probably likely to have that reinforced with this. But your question really is about what about folks who were suspicious that the fix was in, and now that there's a guilty verdict on all counts, will they be? Would that add to their belief that maybe the former president is correct? The truth of the matter, of course, is that former President Trump blames somebody else for everything that goes wrong in his professional and political life. That's one of the reasons why we had January 6th and why he wasn't willing to accept the results of the election, because he believed it couldn't possibly be true that he didn't win, and it couldn't possibly be true here that he broke the law or did something that was that violated campaign finance or whatever, you know, whatever else is facing him. And so you know, that's a refrain that he's going to continue to use. It's been successful to a certain extent, but again, he's got to convince 270. You got to get 270 electoral votes in November, and that's the goal that's in front of him at this point.
How do you think President Biden then combats that, you know, theory that the fix is in and this shouldn't have happened? How do you think President Biden can use that, really?
I don't know that the president will want to address it directly. I mean, certainly if he gets a question, he should talk about it. But this was a state case. This was a case brought by the state, and it didn't have anything to do with the White House. They've said that on a number of occasions. Again, there's going to be folks who will not believe that, no matter how much evidence there is to support it. And there will be folks who are who are on that side of it and believe that that's exactly how it goes. So I don't know that I would be on the defensive if I were the White House about whether or not they had anything to do with this conviction.
Well, bigger picture here, you're a professor. Obviously, politically, you deal with this all of the time. I want to know what you think going forward. What kind of precedent does this set? Obviously, this was a state case, but he was taken to court as a former president. Do you think going forward this will now change how things are done with former presidents, or do you think it's a one-off?
Oh, thanks for that question. That's a great one. I think we're going to have to wait to see how the Supreme Court rules on this immunity question that's in front of us. My hope will be, however they decide to rule, that it's a unanimous decision, because I think that's going to go a long way, especially in a very deeply divided court. But the fact of the matter is that we haven't had this happen in the past, and it's because we haven't had presidents engaging in this type of activity in the past while they were president or after they were done being president. And so I don't know that it's a precedent for moving forward. But if future presidents engage in similar behavior, it is likely that they will be held similarly accountable.
So
I want to ask Pat that question really quickly.
Well, I agree. That was my point. Nobody's done what Trump did. From the Mueller investigation, he calls in the director of the FBI, one-on-one dinner in the Oval Office, and says, "Take it easy on my buddy Michael Flynn." That's obstruction of justice. To me, he's never had a fundamental understanding of the job, what the president does, what the Justice Department does, what the FBI does. So this is so unique that Trump has done so many bizarre things. So listen, when you do color outside the lines, he makes Nixon look like a lightweight, some of the stuff that Trump has done in the last day.
And it kind of dovetails real quick, Professor Caliendo, to my question, which is just this past weekend, Trump very active on social media. You know, he's been sort of dancing around this gag order that Judge Merchan, had levied on him. And, he has been very belligerent with the judge. The judge, my understanding is, and I'm not an attorney, up to 4 years per count, or he could give him probation. Given the weight of this, given the historical precedent, if you were to play the guessing game here, how much pressure is on Merchan with regard to sentencing, which I believe is July 11th?
Oh, man, that's a fantastic question, Scott. I think, if you can get away from offering prison time for an offense of this magnitude, I think that's probably a wise decision. I mean, even folks who are very upset about these sets of circumstances or other things that President Trump did, I think we can agree that this is not the type of offense that would certainly be that would warrant a long prison sentence. Whether he serves any time whatsoever, I don't know. But even having probation as the President of the United States, potentially, right, is going to be very important and very problematic in a number of ways. I mean, if he's not able to travel to foreign countries, I mean, there's just a lot at stake here with the conviction, irrespective of what the nature of the sentence ends up being.
So in your opinion, does this really have an effect on the election at all? That's what I'm hearing when people were starting to talk about the conviction. I heard both sides. It was great, and it doesn't matter. What is your opinion?
Yeah, I would add great, it doesn't matter, and great on the other side, which is it's going to help Trump, right? I mean, I think that you can have it either in any of those ways. I think the sentencing will have something to do with it and the way that they deal with it at the Republican National Convention. We're just so far away from Election Day. November's so far from now. So much is going to happen between now and then. I think I heard a guest earlier on your program mentioning about President Biden's vulnerabilities. Those are certainly real. A lot could happen there, too. And so we're just going to have to keep talking for the next few months, I'm afraid to tell you.
I want to talk to Pat about it, too. As former head of the Illinois Republican Party, you were a prosecutor. Let's say you were still doing that right now. What do you think? What kind of impact do you think that would have on this upcoming election for him?
Well, let's take Illinois. It's devastating in Illinois.
Yeah.
Like we talked before, north of I-74 now, people hate this stuff. So it hurts the Republican Party terribly here in Illinois. Nationally, it's kind of a jump ball, but I think it does hurt him in the states that he needs, some of these swing states of the 6 we talked about before. I think it hurts him with independency. And we talk, when people get indicted here, there's a difference. Like when an alderman gets indicted, there's a difference between, at least perception-wise, an indictment and conviction, in my opinion.
One more question for you, Professor, before we let you go. So 270, you mentioned the magic number. There was recent polling before this verdict today. A majority of registered voters, I think 67%, said that they would not be swayed with regard to the verdict. Guilty or not guilty. Again, given the preponderance of guilty here, 34 counts, do you think that may perhaps, again, even in these swing states where the former president seems to be pulling away from Joe Biden, that this may have an impact?
Right, Scott, and that's the big question. How much of the other 33% of folks who say that they will be impacted, in what way will they be impacted? Will it be impacted against the former president or in favor of him? And then of that 67%, how much of that could be soft? Again, as the months go on, as the campaign wears on, as people really start to think about what this conviction could mean in terms of his ability to carry out duties as commander-in-chief, as the head of government, as head of state, ceremonial duties, etc. And so there'll be lots of time to unpack those things. And as you point out, it doesn't have to be a ton of people, just the right people in the right handful of states, and that can change the outcome of what would be otherwise a different election outcome.